Okay, guys, we are live. Thank you very much for everybody that's in the live chat already waiting. I appreciate you. I appreciate your patience. And thank you very much who's going to be watching us or listening to us later as a podcast as well. I've got a very fun episode today because, as I mentioned on the show before, that I've been meaning to, talk a little bit more about the US politics in the run-up to the elections. And as a result of that, I've been meaning to talk to some people who are maybe a little bit more in the know than me when it comes to these things. And I'm going to be talking to someone today who I've been following for a while and I've been meaning to have on the show for a while as well. And I'm very happy that I'm able to talk to him today. So please help me welcome to the show, Brad Polumbo. Brad, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me so much. I appreciate it, man.
I hope I said your last name right.
Yeah, Palumbo. You got it right. You got it
Terrific.
better than most TV people have ever gotten it. So.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Well, that's the power of YouTube, mate. There you go. You got to do more YouTube.
Is so much better than BoomerTube.
Right? There you go. All right. So before we get started, Brad, why don't you give us a little bit of a background about yourself?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm a political journalist. I work in opinion, so I'm not a reporter. Sure. I very much am writing opinion columns, essays, things that have a clear point of view. I come from kind of a center-right, libertarian, conservative perspective. More right-wing on economics, moderate on social issues, right, cultural issues, very into small government, free markets, capitalism, but also not a social conservative.
Sure.
I got the unique angle of coming at it, being gay in the Republican / conservative world. That's a bit of a unique angle, though not as much these days. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And obviously, I've done a lot of work. I was at the Washington Examiner. I've written for all sorts of U.S. outlets, USA Today, National Review, The Daily Beast, the New York Daily News, all over the place, really. Right. And so that's me in a nutshell.
How big do you think that sort of group within the conservative movement is, like where you fall on that conservative spectrum? How big do you think that group is?
So here's what I would say.
Right.
Among young conservatives, if we're talking about under 35,
okay,
probably like I would estimate it at 25 to 50%,
really?
More or less overlap with my views. However, in the boomer generation, which is the main GOP base right now,
right, not
so much. Though there is a solid chunk of the Republican base that has always been more libertarian leaning, and they still exist.
Right.
But yeah, obviously you've got people who are very much on the Trump train right now and the GOP at large, but young conservatives are not on the Trump train. Some will vote for him, they'll hold their nose and pick him over Biden. But by and large, they're more libertarian on social issues. They have different views on a lot of things, and they've kind of got this young new right, which is more libertarian, and it is more open and less Trump fangirly. And so that's kind of the audience I hope to tap into.
Nice. That's awesome. And, we were talking about this offline, so I want to start with that maybe. And I was telling you about this book I was reading, which sort of talks about the major revolutions around the world in the last few centuries. And one of the things that I've been noticing, especially since I've been reading the media that's based in the United States, is they've been trying to create like a analogy between those major revolutions, whether it was in Russia, France, China, and to the United States today, where they've been saying, all right, well, there's this large group of people who want these major changes to be implemented, whether it comes to like social justice, racial justice, economic justice. And there is this landed gentry that do not want these changes to happen and that are very averse to these changes, or they want these changes to happen at a much slower pace than the rest of the population really does. So we're now reaching like a boiling point. We're reaching a situation where things are going to come to a head and people are going to start taking matters into their own hands. And we're seeing this play out, when we see these protests that have broken out. Now, a lot of people, I think there's a vast majority of people in the country that support the reason behind the protests and why people are protesting. But the way these protests have been carried out in a lot of places and what they have devolved into in a lot of places, is what obviously upsets a lot of people. But there's a section of the media, and there's also a decent chunk of the Democratic Party that either tiptoes around the issue, pussyfoots around the issue, or overtly support it. They say, well, what other choice do they have? Do you notice that?
Yes. And I want to be careful with how I approach this issue, because I agree with you. I am pro criminal justice reform. I want to reduce sentences for drug crimes. I want to ban no-knock warrants. I want to demilitarize the police. All sorts of criminal justice reforms are in line with small government conservatism and libertarian principles. I'm here for it on that. I generally support the Black Lives Matter sentiment, right? I do think police brutality is a problem, and it does have a racial impact, even though I don't think America is a racist, evil country. It does have a disproportionate racist impact on Black Americans, our criminal justice system. That's just a fact. However, you have to almost put the protests and the policy and the movement here, and then the riots and the destruction here. Like, they're two different things at this point. And the rioting and the destruction, I've written about it so much, is so horrendous. It's so awful in the sense that they've burned down 1,500 businesses in Minneapolis. You know how many of those were owned by Black people? I can't give you an exact number, but it's a lot, right? I've seen video after video and interview after interview, and I've reported on this stuff and written about it, of minority-owned businesses torched. I've seen African-American women crying about how their whole neighborhood is destroyed in front of the camera, and they don't have anywhere to go now for their groceries, for their pharmacy. And even more so than that, the economic ramifications of this stuff. I study economics, right? I work at a free market think tank.
Right.
I have looked into this and looked at some of the research in the studies for decades to come. The areas that have been hit by riots will have lower property values, higher insurance rates, fewer jobs, less opportunity, and all of that. And then keep in mind the fact that the George Floyd riots across the country, 15 people died in all that chaos. 15 people. So George Floyd was murdered, and it's a total tragedy, but the riots have been far more destructive than the thing they were supposedly protesting. And that's a serious problem. So I am bothered by the sympathy that you see for this kind of radicalism and movement in the media, where they're downplaying. I mean, a CNN anchor the other day was standing in front of a burning building and saying, things here are mostly peaceful.
That was amazing. It was an amazing piece of news. That headline, fiery but mostly peaceful. Oh, all the Game of Thrones memes, just put them all in there.
Oh my God.
And you wrote an article which I really like, because you made a distinction between Black Lives Matter as an organization and Black Lives Matter as a sentiment. And I think that's a very important distinction to make, because if you look at the top leadership of the Black Lives Matter organizations, they're very sort of Marxist-leaning, very like, oh, we need drastic change and we need it now. Whereas the Black Lives Matter sentiment and the people that support the Black Lives Matter sentiment are more along the lines of what you were just saying about criminal justice reform and all of those things, right? Yeah.
So I can explain it like this, very simply. I'm from Massachusetts, a very liberal state. I know lots of like Democrats and liberals and even progressives, right? Who, if you ask them, do you support Black Lives Matter? They'd say yes. They're not even aware that there is an official organization.
Right.
They just think that's a hashtag, a sentiment, a broad movement, right? And it more or less is. Black Lives Matter at this point has basically just meant, do you care about criminal justice reform and racial equality?
Right.
And a lot of people support that vague notion. However, conservatives point out that there is an official organization, Black Lives Matter TM, like the official group. And they support things like open Marxism and also abolishing the nuclear family.
Yeah.
So they're extreme radical.
What the hell does that even mean, though? Like that. What does that mean? What happens if you abolish the nuclear family?
I guess they think it's a racist institution, I guess. It's like enshrines white supremacy. I don't know, but they're crazy people, that group.
Yeah.
And the problem,
my mom and dad are dicks.
The problem is that that group hasn't been denounced by the left, right? In fact, sometimes they'll even there's this weird infiltration of the mainstream of this super radical left-wing group into kind of liberal circles. They don't condemn it. They don't fully support it. But even sometimes fundraisers go to it and the money goes to it. And because of that has allowed the right to kind of just dismiss that group and dismiss everything that goes with it.
Yeah.
And so you have this is the point of my fee.org article on Black Lives Matter, which people should check out. It's like explaining this difference that neither side seems to get. Liberals look at Republicans talking about how Black Lives Matter is Marxist, and they say, no, it's not. We're not Marxist, and we like it. And then Republicans look at the official organization and apply it to everyone that ever tweeted the hashtag, and that also misses the plot. So more than almost any other issue, Black Lives Matter is an example of how people don't understand each other in today's politics, and it leads to this hyperpolarization and tribalism and more just endless fighting and noise.
Yeah, I do think that the media adds to it as well. The media stokes the confusion, in my opinion, as well. We were just talking about that CNN headline, and in general as well, the kind of coverage from the mainstream media that I've seen is obviously support the movement, which most of us do. But then when it devolves into a riot, when it devolves into widespread looting and like attempts at like actually attacking people, I've seen justifications in the sense that, well, when there is this amount of social injustice in the country, when there is this amount of like racial injustice in the country, can you blame people for acting out? And I'm like, yeah. I can blame people for acting out. Yeah. So I do think that media adds to that confusion too, right? Right.
They do. And here's the thing, like I get the first sentiment of can't blame people for acting out, but actually you can, for two reasons. One is that like I've looked at studies and it's documented that when it crosses from peaceful protesting, which there has been a lot of, into the rioting, looting, and violence, that hurts your cause.
Yeah.
So I've looked at studies of both the 1990s race riots and the 1960s civil rights era, and each time they've traced when the riots became violent to a decrease in public opinion in favor of that movement. Even now, we have new polling that's come out, in I think just this week actually, showing that people's support for Black Lives Matter and for criminal justice reform fell from June to August. Because at first, after George Floyd died in May, it was peaceful, right? It was like a movement. It was protests. It was not rioting and looting. But then it became, over the last couple months, in many of these big cities, an open crime fest. And then it's like, it hurts the movement. It hurts the message. And I'm someone who wants to see major criminal justice reform in this country. And honestly, the rioting and the violence is one of the biggest obstacles to that.
That's true. It really is. And it's the same thing that you were talking about that I see in India as well. From an Indian point of view, the Indian government recently passed this legislation called the Citizenship Amendment Act. And there was initially, a lot of pushback to it. And there was a lot of good faith pushback to it, where people just coming out on the streets and protesting, as is their right. But eventually what it devolved into is like openly anti-Hindu sort of hatred. People were chanting things that were basically, well, we need to put an end to kuffars. We need to put an end to the non-Muslims and things like that. And people are like, well, what does that have to do with government policy? And then it devolved further into like attacks on security personnel, attacks on the police. And then people are like, well, what does that have to do with the government's policy? And so when it devolved into those things, immediately you saw a sudden upsurge in public opinion towards the CAA. So despite the government not issuing any communication or anything like that, just because of what the protesters started doing.
Right. And that's not an exception. That's how this stuff always works. Yeah. I mean, people like Martin Luther King didn't believe in peaceful protest just because that's the morally right thing to do. They also believed in it because it's what works. I mean, you have to compare the peaceful protest to when has someone ever rioted their way into making you agree with them?
Exactly.
Let me give you an example, right? I live in Washington, D.C., right? Well, I live just over the Virginia border, but in the metro area. There was this viral video over the week, or maybe over the weekend, but it's really recent, where just near where some of my friends live in the city, a big mob of protesters started cornering and screaming people sitting outside of restaurants, telling them they had to genuflect for Black Lives Matter. And one couple refused to do so. And there's this huge crowd of people around them screaming at them, right? Do you think that convinced that lady who wouldn't do it? Now she's going to go home and say, I was wrong. Of course not. If anything was going to confirm her priors that movement is radical and crazy and she doesn't support it, it's what they just did. Yeah. And the millions of people at home who see those videos in their timeline, it just reinforces the idea that this whole movement is radical, crazy people. So all this stuff is so counterproductive. And it's almost like a lot of the people I at this point don't even think they really have the best interests at heart of reform. I mean, how many of those people surrounding the lady at the restaurant were white people? Most of them.
Yep.
Right? How many of the people who are rioting and looting are white people? Most of them. How many of the members of Antifa are people of color? Very few. Right?
Yeah.
Like these are not people who actually care about these values as much as they are bad actors and radicals who just want to exploit chaos to do whatever it is they want to do. And that's a real shame.
Yeah, I have a friend here who's black, and he was showing me this Twitter video of these like couple of white kids that climbed on top of like a cop car, and they were just like trying to smash the roof in. And he was like, if I did that, my ass would be 6 feet under. Well, look at these freaking suburban kids just having the time of their lives.
Right. It is true. I mean, and one of the most powerful things I saw during in June when there were the Floyd riots in full form was you had videos of black people who were peacefully protesting with signs or whatever, witnessing rioting and looting, and going up to these people and saying, to these white Antifa people, and saying, stop, they're going to blame us for this.
Yeah.
Get out of here. Stop doing this.
Yeah. And, that discussion sort of brings me to the elections as well, because I honestly, for the longest time, I thought Trump has this in the bag, no problem. And the only time I doubted that a little bit was because Trump has a certain personality. The reason he won the elections in 2016 is because of his personality, because he has this personality when someone attacks him, he never defends his position. He attacks them right back. Right. So if somebody attacks him, then Trump's going to say, okay, lazy so-and-so, sleepy Joe, liar Ted, whatever. That's Trump's style. And I feel like when these protests first broke out, that style was not conducive to communicating his point of view to the country. So people are protesting. He went on the offensive. He said, oh, they're Antifa agents. That old guy that got beat down by the police, he was probably an old Antifa agent. And that's when I started seeing, like, even my friends who were just like, yeah, I kind of like Trump because he's just a never-ending meme and I'll probably vote for him. Even those people that loved the Trump meme were like, I just don't like the way he handled this. He shouldn't have gone on the attack. Right. And that's when they started thinking, well, at least Joe, I know that Joe is not a sentient human being, but at least Joe's talking about bringing people together. Like, that's his entire platform. And I started thinking to me when those friends started saying that to me, I was like, all right, like, that does kind of make sense. Maybe Joe's in here with a shout. But then Joe goes and picks Kamala, which I thought was a very counterproductive pick. I don't know what your opinions are on that.
Pick.
Right.
No, so I'm going to be politically incorrect and say it. Kamala Harris was only picked because of her race and gender.
Right.
And look, I think it's in a sense great that we would have our first female vice president, first black, first Indian vice president. All those things are great.
Oh yeah, I found that out recently, apparently, because she started just identifying as Indian.
Well, she actually is. She's not Elizabeth Warren.
Right, I know.
But the thing is that it's bad because it's being done in a tokenistic way. Biden specifically said he would only pick a woman, and he never said it specifically, but he pretty much made it clear he was only looking at minority women. So it's not like she was picked for her own merit. If you were picking somebody who for their own merit, you wouldn't pick someone who locked up truant moms and laughed about imprisoning people over nonviolent marijuana charges. You wouldn't pick someone who lost horribly in the Democrat race and called you a racist. She literally stood on the debate stage and looked at Joe and was like, you are a segregationist racist and you hurt me as a little girl. And then 5 minutes later, she's like, I'll be your VP now. Right? Like,
she said, I believe his accusers.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So she's
in
not
the era of Me Too.
Person. And like someone like Amy Klobuchar would have just been objectively a better selection on every single point, but not woke enough, not identity politics enough, right? A white woman, that doesn't get you enough points in 2020. And so Biden really only picked Kamala to fend off the woke left and try to throw a bone to the identity politics crowd. But it was a huge mistake, in my opinion, because those people are going to vote for him anyway. And that's like kind of basing your electoral decisions around blue check Twitter is not a smart way to win an election. But so I agree with your point about Trump. And I'll even make it a little bit broader, right? Because Trump has his personality, and I think it can be good in some situations, but in other situations, he seems unfit, unserious, like not a competent president. And the coronavirus and then George Floyd's death both made that seem really, really clear. Like, this dude can't be a good leader in a time of national crisis. Then what happened is it started to spiral out of control. And then when you have all these riots and looting, and then you have Democrat officials kneeling with the rioters or telling police were given stand down orders and just told to just let them go wild. That's the kind of thing that Americans see, and they'll say, I'm not letting these people run the country. Yeah. And also on in terms of that, it's like Trump is on footing where he'll win, right? In terms of law and order, in chaos. That is a really good spot for him to be in. Whereas in the previously, before it went to all that, he was looking really weak. So if things stay the same and that keeps going on out of control, yeah, I mean, a lot of people will pull the lever for him, even if they otherwise don't like him.
Yeah, and I think the Kamala pick helps him to an extent as well, especially seeing as Kamala seems to be the one that is going to be calling the shots going forward. Because if you saw the DNC, one person that was conspicuous by her absence was Tulsi Gabbard, someone who I happen to like a lot, because I also think she's sometimes a little too honest for her own good. But at the same time, that's someone that I really do respect a lot. And she was very conspicuous by her absence. And it seemed to me that there was a very pointed sort of gesture by Kamala Harris, that the reason she was not there was because Kamala Harris says, I don't want her here. And that's a real shame. I do think that's a real shame for the Democratic Party, because this is someone, Tulsi Gabbard was genuinely someone who was able to rally support from pretty much all sections of the American populace. Like the far left progressives liked her because of her anti-war stance. Libertarians liked her also because of the same reason. A lot of Democrats liked her. A lot of Republicans liked her. Freaking Ann Coulter liked her. You know,
so I'll put my bias out front. I was a Tulsi stan. I love Tulsi, but so I would never vote for her because she is a progressive, right? She has left-wing policy views on most things that don't match up with me. What I like about her is she seems like a genuinely good person, right? She is a war hero who literally helped injured people in like the front lines of battle. And she has a very level-headed anti-war foreign policy as a result. But she's also just a good person. Like, she doesn't condemn people that disagree with her. She was one of the only Democratic candidates that was going on, you know, her and Andrew Yang. He's the other one who gets credit for this. But she was going on like Fox News and David Rubin's show and talking to independents, libertarians, conservatives, Republicans, Trump supporters. And she's not saying you're awful. She's just saying, I disagree with you, and here's why. Right? She was one of the only people that wasn't this tribalist. Like, for example, she voted to impeach Trump on one of the counts and voted not to on the other count. Like, that's the sign that she's like an objective thinker, not just some Team Blue automaton, right? And that's why people liked her. But because she's honest is why she called out Kamala Harris at the debate and said, you locked up moms with truant kids and laughed about throwing people in jail for smoking a joint. And now you're sitting here telling us you're the progressive prosecutor? That went viral, and that was amazing.
And that pretty much tanked Kamala's campaign.
Right. Kamala never recovered.
Nope.
And then you have to say, why is it that Tulsi wasn't invited to speak at the DNC when historically any candidate that wins delegates in a primary, which Tulsi did, she won 2 delegates from American Samoa, is invited to speak, except Tulsi Gabbard. You tell me why that might be, huh?
Exactly. And it's a real shame. It really does. I don't think it sends a good message to voters from the Democratic Party that, people that disagree with us on some major issues are people that we cannot tolerate. That's the message that it's sending.
Across the establishment, get punished.
Yeah, exactly.
It also tells us that Kamala's already calling the shots, right? So Joe is not a crazy left-wing radical. He's not an awful person, right? Like, he's Joe Biden, but he's also ancient. And a couple things could happen. One is that, and I'm not saying this, I don't want this to happen. I'm really wishing the guy for good health. He could die during his first term. That's just a fact we have to think about. And that would leave Kamala Harris totally in charge of our country. Second, though, is another option where he doesn't die, but he just kind of fades into the background and lets his team take over. And Kamala calls a lot of the shots behind the scenes. That's a very realistic possibility. But third, it's almost guaranteed that Kamala is a 2024 frontrunner. Biden is not going to run it for a second term. It's very unlikely, right, because of his age. So this puts her, and she is far left on policy, and she's illiberal, fundamentally illiberal in her worldview in terms of crushing the opposition, in terms of using the government to squash people in her quest for political power, right? So she is truly—
and saying whatever it takes, basically.
Oh, she laughed when Joe Biden actually said to her, they both support an assault weapons ban, but he said, you don't have the constitutional authority to do that. And she just laughed at him and was like, oh, please, we'll do it. Yes, we can, Joe. Yes, we can. Right? Like, she just doesn't even care about the limits that the Constitution imposes on her ability to do some of this stuff. She just laughed about it. So I think it's really disturbing that she's already calling the shots and that she's now in this prime position to just take over if things go even slightly awry.
What do the policies in like a Kamala Harris presidency or Kamala Harris in charge look like?
A couple things. She is far left on economics. She's not a full socialist, but she actually supports 40 trillion in new spending over a decade. To put that in comparison, that's 25 times more than Hillary Clinton supported in 2016.
Wow.
So Kamala Harris has actually consistently ranked as in the top 3 most liberal senators, most left-wing in terms of all the people in the Senate in terms of her voting record. So she's not like an AOC, like she's not trying to seize the means and turn us into the Green Party's wet dream, but she's like really pushing us in a left-wing perspective. And the other thing that's probably more disturbing is that she's willing to prosecute the culture war through the power of the government, right? So like a Kamala Justice Department would absolutely seek to squash conservatives, squash Republicans in all the ways, in all the hot button issues, right? Like, she has proven herself prone to abuses of power throughout her entire career. So all these ways, like the gun thing, right? She's not going to debate the gun issue. She's going to write an executive order.
Well, that's what she said pretty much, right? Yeah.
Right. And so that's the kind of thing that's really concerning about her policy, is not just what she's going to do, because what she's going to do isn't that different from a standard Democrat. It's how she's going to do it and how ruthless she's demonstrated herself to be. Yeah.
And another thing that kind of bums me out with Tulsi not being there and the establishment Democrats winning out and the sort of establishment Republicans winning out, what really bums me out is that no matter who it is, whether it's the Democrats in power or the Republicans in power, the foreign policy isn't really going to change fundamentally. Yeah. Foreign policy is going to remain the same. And that was one of the reasons why I genuinely liked Tulsi Gabbard, because she was someone who had been on the front lines. She had someone who had seen the cost of war. She was someone who had seen what it costs to send her brothers and sisters out to just die for a meaningless war, really.
Right.
But at the end of the day, no matter who's in charge, that isn't going to change now, which is a real shame, because if you look at what the sheer human cost, okay, forget about the economic cost, which is already massive, but even just the human cost of this protracted war in Afghanistan, whatever the hell's happened in Iraq, and now, the boots on the ground in Syria and all that nonsense, just the sheer human cost, and obviously add to that the monumental cost, that's not going to change, and that's a real shame.
So I will say first and foremost, that will not change under a Biden administration or a Harris administration at all. They're the definition of status quo is foreign policy establishment Democrats. So, I mean, Biden voted for the Iraq war and doesn't regret it. These are not people who are going to bring the troops home. I will say, so we very much know what we're going to get from the Democrat side. The Republican side, I'm cautiously optimistic just on foreign policy. Trump's got a lot of flaws, but I like his foreign policy approach, at least his instincts, right? He talks about wanting to end the war in Afghanistan. So coming from the right, I can't tell you how huge it is that we have a president who's a Republican that talks about anti-endless war, bringing the troops home. 10 years ago, that would have gotten you excommunicated from the GOP, even saying that. So will he follow through with it? maybe not. Maybe if he's not tethered to an election and if he doesn't staff his administration the second time around with John Bolton's, he might not. But he has opened a path. This is one of the upsides of Trump. He's opened a path to be an anti-war Republican or conservative that 10 or 15 years ago, you would have been literally tossed out of the party and called a traitor to America, right? Under the true neoconservative dominance of 2008, right? Like now he has opened this door. And I think it is possible that he could bring the troops home from Afghanistan in his second term. I do think it's possible. It might not happen, but it could. He's not going to bring home and end all the wars, but we could see some small progress under a second Trump term on foreign policy. It is possible.
Where do you think, let me ask you this, where do you think the future of somebody like Tulsi Gabbard lies? Because I think she's too bright of a candidate to just fade away into the distance. I would really not like to see that happening. But it's fairly clear at this point until something drastic happens that her future doesn't lie with the Democratic Party. Where does her future lie?
She has no future in the two-party system. And it pains me to say that. She's never going to become a Republican. People who say that are just like being ridiculous. I mean, she's left-wing on policy. So she's not going to become a Republican, and that's fine. But she's not going to be a Democrat anytime soon in this party the way that it is. If you question identity politics as she has, you can't do that. If you question establishment foreign policy, you can't do that. You're allowed to do all sorts of radical things, but only the radical things that the establishment has embraced, right? And she doesn't accept some of those, while does accept some radical stuff on the stuff she's truly principled in, like foreign policy. So she's got no future in the two-party system, and I hate the two-party system. So I'm optimistically hoping that there should really be at minimum 4 or 5 parties in the U.S. A leftist party, like a left-wing party, a center-left party, a libertarian party, and then like a nationalisty right party, and then another like moderate or independent party. Like we really should have a much more diverse coalition that would much more accurately represent actual people's beliefs, and she would have a very promising future in that kind of system. As things stand now, though, I just don't see a path for her to really do anything more, and that's really sad. But
what prospects do you see at any point in the short to medium term for a 4-party system like that? Like
very minimal, very low of any kind, because like I'm more libertarian leaning, so I would love to see the Libertarian Party succeed. The Libertarian Party as it exists now is a freaking joke. Like it is like at the convention in 2016, a sweaty fat dude in a thong like danced on the stage and beat his chest. Like it's a fundamentally unserious party. They had Vermin Supreme, who was a hilarious meme, but he was like one of the top presidential candidates. Like that's the dude who says, I'll give everyone a pony if elected, and where's the boo? Like, it's just a joke. And then they run candidates that are really extreme. So Jo Jorgensen, who is the current Libertarian Party nominee, isn't one of these crazy people, but she is like a total anarchist. She's not like a realistic libertarian like Justin Amash or someone who's worked in government and doesn't believe in total anarchy, but has libertarian views and could win to the public. She's just one of these people that like, I hope she does well, but I just don't think she will. And the Green Party's in the same boat. I mean, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So I just don't see prospect for it, really.
What is the libertarian sort of stance on foreign policy? Do they have one?
Oh, yeah. The libertarian stance on foreign policy is very clear. They're very anti-war, anti-interventionist. Bring the troops home.
What does intervention, like, is there any active intervention from the Libertarian Party, or is it mostly like reactive? Like if something comes to us, then we react?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak for the Libertarian Party, right? Because I'm not an official part of it or anything like that. But libertarians generally, it's not that they believe in no foreign policy or no intervention, but it's like only in a direct threat to our national security. Not because we want to go spread democracy or because we think there should be regime change. None of that. So to give you an example, Senator Rand Paul has talked about how the beginning of the invasion into Afghanistan was justified, right? Because in Afghanistan, they did harbor the terrorists that carried out the 9/11 attacks. So we went in, we punished them for that. Mission accomplished after 2 years, end the war, bring them all back.
Yeah.
The next 18 years or whatever have been a failed experiment in regime change and nation building to prop up a failed democracy, and it's been a total disaster. That's not something libertarians support. So libertarians would bring home the troops from Afghanistan, bring the troops home from Syria, bring them home from Iraq, take them out of Saudi Arabia. I don't know why Trump sent troops to Saudi Arabia. That's absurd.
Right.
So that would be the libertarian approach. It's not that they're like they still want to have a military and still want to. It's pretty similar to what I would say like Tulsi Gabbard or progressive left believes. They're not like total isolationists. We want trade. We want diplomacy. We want to protect our national security if we have a direct threat. But we want to stop the endless wars and stop the democracy experiments and regime change, because you end up just leaving places much worse off and leaving trillions of dollars and American bodies all burned to the ground. So it's a sad thing. And I do think the libertarian vision of foreign policy has been successful in infiltrating the GOP somewhat. And so that's a promising trend. Honestly, like there is no third party viability, but ideas promoted by third parties can seep into the mainstream, both on the left and right. And that's probably the most promising avenue.
Yeah. And another thing that, you were talking about Kamala Harris having more control now that she's been picked to be Joe Biden's VP candidate, and she's going to be calling the shots from now on pretty much. And you were talking about her being, pretty radically progressive policy-wise. And for a while, people in the Democrat circles and people outside of the Democrat circles as well, they had this idea that these people like AOC and these people like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, all these people, they were kind of the fringe of the party. They were just the loud minority that Trump used to magnify because it helped Trump a lot. But now that you see Kamala Harris in such a commanding position, and now that you see that, when AOC and all these people won, it wasn't really a fluke. AOC won her seat again, Rashida Tlaib won again, Ilhan Omar won again, and they seem to have slightly more of a presence within the party. Is that something that you can see happening in the future, like the progressive wing of the Democratic Party gaining more and more influence?
Yeah, for sure. Because those people they represent the younger generation for sure. That's growing. Right. And then the establishment faction represents an older portion of the Democrat base that is more sizable and does include most minority voters as well. But there's a rising tide of left-wing sentiment because of the Tlaibs and the AOCs, and they're tapping into something real. I mean, AOC, setting aside all her politics, which I totally disagree with, right? But she's a masterful influencer, right? Like she has so much influence in such an audience. And there's power that comes with that. And that is rising. That's a rising tide in American politics, that left-wing influence and power. But here's what's not changing. The establishment power is very entrenched in the institutions of the Democratic Party and the media. So these people are left-wing, but they're not leftists. And they're not going to become leftists. The people that control CNN and the New York Times and the people that run the DNC, the establishment has a death grip on that. And that's not changing anytime soon, but they can be dragged to the left by insurgent movements. That's what we've seen in the last 5 years. I mean, I like to compare Hillary Clinton's 2016 platform to what the 2020 Democrats are running on now. It's crazy. Yeah. It's moved to the left enormously, in part because of people like Bernie Sanders, who's dragged the party to the left. And he's now part of the mainstream, and he used to be the fringe crazy uncle dude that everyone just kind of let sit in his corner over there. Now he's like part of the party and very influential. So I do think that's definitely growing, which somewhat from my perspective is not good. Yeah. That's what's happening. In some ways it's good, right? Because they're more leftist on foreign policy or whatever. But in terms of the economy, there is a rising tide that is much more socialist and much more wants to get the government involved in many aspects of our life. And from where I sit, that's not a good thing, but that is what's happening.
Yeah, and that really makes me think, because initially you were saying that people that are under the age of 35, conservatives, they're more sort of libertarian leaning. And now we're talking about these group of people that have a real audience in the younger people, younger sort of left-leaning people. And their politics are very, very different from the libertarian-leaning politics. So is it safe to assume maybe, or do you think it's projecting a little bit too much, that in the next 10 years, politically, these two sections are going to be even further apart than the Democratic and Republican parties are right now?
No, I don't think it's safe to assume that, because they'll be apart on different things. Like, let me give you an example. They're like, young people aren't going to be as far apart when they're the mainstream on LGBT issues.
Sure.
Young Republicans don't really care. They're very laissez-faire. They're pro-gay marriage overwhelmingly, right? So there's not going to be as much disagreement there.
Right.
They also are more concerned about climate change and global warming. So there's not going to be as much disagreement there. There are a variety of issues. They're like criminal justice reform. They're going to have more agreement, right? So there are some issues where there's going to be more overlap. They're going to be more diametrically opposed on two things: socialism and the economy. There's going to be a far left socialist crowd, the AOC, versus a free market, or at least not socialist. Right. These young people are very much anti-socialist in every way. That's kind of one of their main principles, even if they're not fully pro-free markets, right? Trump is hardly a purist of capitalism, right? But that's going to be one of the fault lines. Abortion is going to be a big fault line, actually. People don't realize this, but Gen Z, in terms of the right-leaning people, is more pro-life than previous generations.
Really?
Yeah. Isn't that unexpected?
I would not have thought that, yeah.
I would not have thought it either, but that is the case. So we are seeing that. That's going to be a big ticket issue. And then the other one is going to be social justice and illiberalism. So the SJW mentality and mobbing and cancel culture and all of that is going to keep rising on the left, and a reactionary hostility towards it is going to keep rising on the right. And that's going to be a big issue, a big dividing line.
Yeah, and we were talking about this offline earlier as well, and you wrote an article about this. Oh no, I think somebody wrote an article about this, and you may have shared it, or I might have seen it on someone else's timeline, but it was in the New York Times, and it was basically talking about how the Republican Party is slowly purging the libertarian elements within it, and it's moving a little bit more towards bigger government. And that's a bit of a trend that we've seen overseas as well. India, obviously, it's a very different case from the United States, but the quote unquote right wing in India is extremely, it's pretty big government. It's pretty in favor of big government. And we've seen that in the UK elections as well. And how well the Tories did and Boris Johnson did was obviously mainly because of how committed he was to Brexit, but also because he put a lot of weight behind the NHS. He put a lot of weight behind sort of big government spending. And that seems to have paid off for him politically. And do you see that as happening with the Republican Party as well, that they see that, okay, maybe some big government programs can really pay off in a big way politically?
Politically, they can. That's the thing about big government, is like, there's always political gain to be found in promising people free stuff and promising people the government will fix everything. It's just whether it actually works out, right? But politicians don't always care about that. That's their successor's problem.
Right.
But so what I'll say is there's two paths for the future of the Republican Party. It all is going to depend on what happens after Trump, because Trump is not ideological. So he's a capitalist, and he passed tax cuts and deregulation, but then he likes big government on trade and tariffs, and he likes big government. He doesn't care about the national debt or fiscal conservatism. So he's broken this mold and allowed for this growth of right-wing big government populism to emerge. But it's all going to depend on what happens after Trump. If they go back to orthodoxy with somebody like Nikki Haley as the next nominee, she's going to go back to free market, limited government. But if it's someone like Tucker Carlson or like Josh Hawley that becomes the next nominee, those people will make that Trumpist big government the new normal, and they will take it in that direction. So it could go one of two ways. There's always going to be a libertarian right, whether it exists within the GOP and the conservative movement will be determined by which way they head after Trump.
Right. That is interesting, because, one of the arguments that I hear is that when it's completely, and obviously economics is not my strong suit, so I might just talk out my ass for the next 2 minutes. But what the argument that I hear, and I'm just going to put it to you because you know about this better than I do, that when you have that kind of unfettered free market system, when you have that kind of unfettered capitalist society, there is going to be inadvertently a group of people that will get left behind, and that it is the duty of the state, or it is the duty of the people of the country to make sure that the people that quote unquote got left behind get taken care of. So a certain amount of government programs are absolutely a necessity. I mean, that is the opinion of, I would think, a large majority of people in India. And when I was reading about the UK elections, that's the opinion of a lot of people, whether they're on the left or they're on the right in the UK as well, and that's probably why it paid off so well politically. What is your opinion on that?
I mean, so don't mistake me for an anarchist. It's not that I think there should be no government programs at all. I want very minimal government dependency, and I would restructure all welfare in a way like you'd almost be better off having a UBI and no welfare than you would be having welfare that discourages work, like food stamps, like unemployment, and like all SNAP and all these programs.
Right.
So it's not that I would have no government, but I think so much of the inequality and inefficiency in our current system is derived through actually not free markets, but by big government. We have a huge problem with crony capitalism in this country. Our healthcare system sucks and screws over everyone, but not because it's free market capitalist. It's the farthest thing from that.
That's
it's
true.
A crony capitalist, heavily regulated industry where government controls like a third of the spending and highly regulates the rest. And they have it full of carve-outs for big pharma and for lobbyists and for hospitals and doctors' unions and all sorts of stuff, right? Like, let me give you an example.
Right.
They sell insulin for $17 in Mexico. That's the same exact kind that you could buy that's FDA approved in the US for over $500, right? Whoa. Why can't you buy it? Because of regulations that ban the import of medication that were secured by the lobbying of the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
So it's like a lot of the problems here come from big government and crony capitalism. We're not in a free market society. We're in a market society, but it's like socialism versus capitalism is not a one or the other. It's a spectrum. Right. And we are in somewhere in the middle in this murky crony capitalist corporatist mix. Some industries are worse than others. Healthcare is the worst of the bunch.
Right.
So what I would say is that the people that are being left behind, it's not that I deny that. There are people that are being left behind. It's why. And a lot of times government is the problem, not the solution from the economic school of thought that I come from.
Right. What would be a solution to this? Like, do you think that any party, either party, whether the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, wants to solve this problem of how muddled the healthcare system is?
No, but there are individuals within the parties that do.
Okay.
Neither party has answers for anything. They just want to get elected. Right. But I mean, there are people like individuals who have principled policy ideas and have put them forward. Even I think Bernie Sanders has supported, like with some like Rand Paul and other people, importing medicine. Like that's a free market thing that would help people. But I could name 10 free market ways that could help uplift people right now. Yeah. Get rid of occupational licensing laws that every state has that make it illegal to braid hair without a permit that costs thousands of dollars, right? Those kill billions in economic growth every year for the poor and minorities especially. Another thing you could do is school choice. I'm a big believer in school choice. A lot of times right now, rich people have school choice. They can send their kid to private school. They can move to a wealthy district that has a really nice school, but it's the poor kids and the black kids that are stuck in the failing public schools, and school choice would allow them to have actual opportunity and succeed. And it's proven to work. That's a free market conservative reform that would help the people who are being left behind.
Right.
Those two are just, I mean, I could go on for 10 hours.
Do you see that at all though from either of the big candidates or either of the big parties? Do you see any solutions that you like?
So the Republicans do support school choice overwhelmingly. Okay. That is a thing. Another thing that's free market is criminal justice reform. And we have seen the Republican Party support it somewhat. I mean, President Trump's signed the First Step Act. There's a long way to go, and they certainly don't support enough, but there is some progress from it. And So there are some ways that the Republican Party is pushing that are free market, that would help people, like criminal justice reform, like school choice. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I don't like to concede the notion that many people have that government is how you help people, because a lot of the ways in America, at least, that people are being screwed over is by the government.
Right. That makes sense. That's a good point. I would finally just want to ask you, so you were talking about Nikki Haley. You know, I find Nikki Haley a very interesting candidate as well. And is she like more libertarian leaning? Is that what you said earlier? No.
So here's the thing about Nikki Haley. She is a traditional conservative in the mold of like a Buckley-esque Bush era. So the three-legged stool, like Reaganism. Right. She's economic libertarian, a foreign policy hawk.
Interesting.
A social moderate conservative. So she is like pro-life, but she's also like kind of pro-LGBT. Chill on that. Okay. So she's like a moderate social conservative.
Right.
She's a neoconservative foreign policy hawk. And then she's an economic libertarian. So she would represent a return to that part where the GOP was at least libertarian on economics, where it's kind of abandoned that under Trump somewhat, right? Some things, tax cuts, deregulation, yes, but then they don't care about the debt at all anymore, which is a real problem and a real shame and very hypocritical.
Right.
And then they don't care about free trade anymore. But Nikki Haley would bring us back to caring about the debt, small government economics, free trade. Yet she would also bring us away from the America First anti-war foreign policy. So it's you give and you get.
Right.
So that's kind of who she is in a nutshell. And she's been threading the line of sucking up to Trump as a person and on politics without actually moving away from her original policy views. So she could, if she gets elected in 2024 as the Republican nominee, she could lead the party back in that direction.
How likely do you think that is?
I think it's like pretty likely.
Wow.
She's going to be one of the top three contenders.
So we're looking at possibly Nikki Haley, Kamala Harris.
Yes.
Oof. Well, that'll be fun. That'll be fun. That'll be plenty for Indians to talk about, I guess. Yeah, that'll be funny. Well, look, I better leave it there. I know you're a bit pressed on time as well, but this was fun, man. This was really educational for me because especially on the sort of economic side of things is not something that is really my strong suit. So it's always good to talk to differing points of view on that. So thank you for coming on and thank you for doing this today, Brad. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. This was fun, guys. I'll leave links to where you can follow Brad in the description of this YouTube video. You can check it out over there. You can read his articles over there as well. Make sure to go follow Brad. If you like today's episode, make sure to like, subscribe, share, all of that fun stuff as well. Watch out for more fun guests in the lead up to the elections. And hopefully we'll be able to get Brad on again to talk about some stuff in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right, Brad, just stick around for a second offline when we go offline. But other than that, guys, we'll see you next week. Stay happy.